Hello and welcome back to Education on Fire. Today I'm delighted to be chatting to Lisa Pinkerton. Now she's Head of Education at Widget and a former Deputy Head Teacher, Inclusion Lead and Lead Facilitator on the NPQ SENCO course. Now Widget is a pioneering software company with a passion for symbols-based communication. They empower individuals to express themselves independently through symbols, aiding comprehension and understanding across any learning environments. Their solutions are designed to support educators by enhancing inclusive learning environments while promoting meaningful interactions. Now, Lisa believes that real change in education is really helped by SENCOs sitting on the senior leadership team. Now, this ensures that inclusion isn't just a bolt-on, but built into decisions from the start that can support all pupils. Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Education on Fire podcast. It's great to chat to so many different people in different ways, I think, because it's very easy for people to talk about maths needs to look this way, English needs to look this way, based on the way the government sets everything up in testing and all that sort of stuff. And I think, as everyone knows, Education on Fire is about having the child at the heart of what we do. And it seems very much that Widget is very much centered around that, you know, supporting people how to be in a position to kind of make everyone be heard and seen and communicate in that kind of way. And I know today we're going to be focusing on SENCOs and that kind of thing. But I think just to get us going, just sort of set that scene of Widget and of course your role within it.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm Head of Education here at Widget Software and have been since September of this year. Prior to that, I was a primary educator for 26 years, I believe, and a large part of that was an inclusion lead and deputy head teacher. Widget's been a huge part of that journey all the way through, and we are very much positioned as ordinarily available provision. So yes, Widget has a place to play for children with additional needs. Absolutely, we know that. We know the benefits of symbols and visuals as scaffolds. But actually, we have a phrase here which is essential for some and beneficial for all. And that's very much how we see Widget symbols, is actually they have a place for every member of school society. So yes, that interesting conversations going on at the moment about universal provision, and we very much sit at the heart of that.
Yeah, amazing. So our focus, as I mentioned, is going to be SENCO and also where that fits within the leadership team. And we talked about that community aspect. We talked about communication, and it sort of seems like a no-brainer that everyone who's integral to the way the school runs, bearing in mind the school is there for the pupils, it would seem that it's always been like that for sure. And then you suddenly realize maybe not quite so much, and also there's still some kind of work to be done to make that difference moving forward.
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking now about inclusion at a time when, you know, the numbers of children being identified with SEND in mainstream settings has never been higher. I think we've got more than 1.7 million pupils in England currently identified as having SEND, and that's only the ones that are identified. You know, that's nearly 1 in 5 of our pupils. The vast majority of these are in our mainstream settings. So where SEND used to perhaps at one time be seen as a specialist issue and need a specialist to meet all the needs of those pupils, it's not really. It's now a leadership issue. And actually, as an ex-SENCO, as an inclusion lead, that's exactly where I think it should be sat, actually, as part of a leadership team, as part of the main decision making of a school. We should be having inclusion at the heart of everything. And I regularly talk about my belief about the 3 Ps of inclusion, which is everyone should feel present, everyone should be able to participate, and everyone should be able to make progress, regardless of their starting points. So that's absolutely fundamental to education in my eyes.
Yeah, it really is. And it seems like it's a really important point at the moment because, of course, with the recent white paper and the sense of inclusion is a key thing that the government are really talking about, and the support that they deem should be in place will be in place. We'll see how that starts to get sort of rolled out as time goes on. So how do you sort of see this changing going forward? And will there be a kind of, it needs to look a certain way, or do you think it's more about the fact that leaders need to be thinking, of course, we want it to be more supportive, and that inclusion is therefore going to be a natural progress rather than a given, so to speak.
Yeah, I think there are so many pulls and challenges on head teachers and leadership teams in education currently. You've got the demands in terms of outcomes, attendance, budget cuts, all of those things that you're trying to juggle all of the time. Sometimes historically send and inclusion has been a bit of a bolt on and an add-on, and it's very clear now the direction of travel is not as having inclusion as an add-on. We could argue about the reasons we've got to that point. It could be financial reasons, it could be all sorts of reasons, and I'm not really interested in how we've got to this point. What I'm really pleased is that inclusion is now very much part of the conversation. And head teachers, leaders need to be very aware that it's at the heart of um, the SEND reforms, obviously, and planning going forward, but also at the heart of inspections. It's a huge part. They're not just going to be looking to see how your SENCO's doing. It's how is inclusion part of the culture in the school. And really, that means those people who have the knowledge and expertise in SEND need to be holding a strategic role on the leadership team.
And do you think, you sort of mentioned people that have been sort of identified as special education needs, and obviously those that maybe are struggling but haven't been identified formally. That obviously makes a difference, like you say, in terms of financial implications in the way that you're sort of including them within your school. But if we take the average child, everyone has a need in some way, whatever that spectrum is, or whatever their skill set is, or however they learn. So do you think just having this conversation and actually adopting it for every child, no matter who they are, kind of changes the conversation and the thought of inclusion, rather than it just being, like you say, a particular section of people, so to speak?
Yeah. And I think, one of the things I'm cautiously optimistic about actually is that we are putting inclusion at the heart of planning at the outset. So it's not, oh, well, the kind of old sort of medical model of disability that, here's a child and they have an issue, they have a problem, they're going to need support to fix it. We're actually thinking now more from the social model of disability, where we're thinking, is the environment suitable? What changes can we make to make our environment a place where everybody can learn to the best of their ability? So what adaptations can we make at the point of planning? As I mentioned, that's where Widget sits. We talk about, having visual timetables and visual scaffolds, just as everyday, ordinarily available provision. And I think that's a really positive thing. Even from my own personal experience, my daughter is 12 years old. She's neurotypical. She goes to a grammar school. Um, Prior to that, she went to a primary school that was very heavy in terms of their send percentages. And I think a lot of people were quite surprised that in my position as at that point, a deputy head teacher, I was sending my daughter to a school with high proportions of send. Well, my argument is, if a school is really good at meeting a child's needs, that means they're really good at meeting everybody's needs. So whether they are a child who is struggling, who maybe not working at, so say, expected levels of development, I won't go down that route to talk about how I feel about that, but actually they're also going to be really good at meeting the needs of the children who are doing very well and are very academically capable. And I was right. But the actual additional bonus of that is that my child went to a values-driven school where she learned about a whole variety of learners, a whole variety of people, and I think came out as a better human being because of it. So I think as you said, it's about not necessarily seeing individual needs and how we meet those individual needs. If we are planning with inclusion in mind at the outset, we are meeting the needs of every child.
And I think one of the key things you sort of mentioned there was the fact that it can change this week to next week in terms of policy. It can be the child needs this in the government's eyes, in the school's eyes, and then next week it might be different. The child is still the same. Their needs are probably
Absolutely.
still the same. Everything else around it has changed. And I think one of the things that I always think and talk about is the fact that I've no idea what the policies were when I was at school. And quite frankly, I don't care. I did know how I felt in school. I did know what my experiences were, and like you say, and what the environment was. And
Yeah,
luckily for me, music was the thing that I loved. I managed to become a professional musician, and it was the opportunities I had in school that gave me that opportunity. And I think for now, the same thing is true, that there isn't a child in any school that's like, oh, if only I'd been born 10 years ago, it would have been different. Or if I was born 10 years later, maybe the system would be different. They are going through what they're going through now. And the same for the staff. They are within the confines that they are. But I think the sorts of conversations that we're able to have is actually, despite all of that, we can make those differences. And simple things like, how things are displayed. Are we doing things from an oral point of view or an audio point of view, or is it more visual? Or just the fact that we're even aware enough to decide that we want it to be that
yeah.
just changes everything.
Absolutely. I mean, was it Maya Angelou that said, you don't remember what people say, you remember how they make you feel?
Exactly.
I hope I'm quoting that correctly. But it's absolutely that. And I think if we are keeping children at the heart of all the conversations all the time, if we are making decisions based on our values, based on our beliefs, regardless of policy, and for me, obviously, as a SENCO, as an inclusion lead, mine would always be about how are we making our environment as inclusive as possible. Let's go into a classroom, let's go into a school and think, is this communication friendly? What are the sensory issues when I go into this room? What are the potential barriers to learning? How can I overcome those? Then automatically we're making an inclusive learning environment. So regardless of what's coming through in the SEND reforms, regardless of what's coming through in terms of inspection, if we're keeping the children at the heart of the conversations all the time, then we're going to be making the right decisions. Um, my background is in early years. I spent many, many years as a reception teacher, and that is what early years is all about. It's considering, here's the child in front of me at this moment in time. What do I need to help them make progress?
Yeah, I love that. And I think that there's something to be said about just realizing that all of us are an integral part of our children's upbringing. And also, we are the grown-ups. It's that sort of from a parental point of view, we used to have these sort of funny conversations about the fact that, you know, your child wants to experiment. They want to sort of run away from you. They want to do all the things that they do from a play point of view and to learn. Our job is to be the adult, to know that we're not going to let them do that in a road because we know that's dangerous. They may not know that when they're very young.
Yeah.
So you set the environment, you set the boundaries, you set everything up as the adult to therefore allow them to thrive. You give them soft landings when they fall in, sort of figuratively. And it just becomes part and parcel of what you do. And I think from an educational point of view, that's the same. We know we have policies to do. We know there are inspections. There are all those things. And whether we would like to change them or not, as the adults, we can set the environment as best we can to give them soft landings, the ability to explore and to grow, but understand that we can see the bigger picture. They don't really
Yeah.
need to know that, but that's sort of
No,
our job.
totally. And it was interesting what you said actually, because you know, I've got a real passion for making sure that we don't make the road too smooth either, because I think sometimes we make everything too smooth to children so they don't experience the bumps in the road. And actually, what we should be doing is giving them risks, manage risks, obviously. Say, not throwing children out into the middle of the road, as you said, but actually they have to learn to become resilient to the little bumps in the road, because there are bigger bumps ahead potentially in the future. And if we haven't built resilience in our children, how are they going to manage the big bumps?
Yeah.
So no, that should be planned into everything that we're doing. I totally believe. I mean, I one of the books that changed my life was Paul Dick's When the Adults Change. I actually was listening to it on Audible, which I would highly recommend, because that's when you're listening to him actually speaking. And I was on the way to my mum's house. I had to pull off the road because I had to write things down immediately. It was one of those books that had that impact on me. And there's a lot of stuff and fluff out there at the moment about restorative practice. But sometimes I think it's because people don't understand what sits behind it. There's this misconception that restorative practice is all about removing boundaries and children can just do whatever they want and there's no consequence. That word keeps coming back about consequence. But it's actually not. It's being really clear in expectations and making children understand their part to play in those expectations. We don't have to bark orders at children for them to understand it. We have to approach things differently. but it's not a softer option. It's just being more explicit in what the expectations are. And sometimes we make assumptions that children know what expectations are and they don't. You
Yeah.
know, we say, if a child, there's the poem, isn't there? If a child cannot read, we teach them. If a child can't write, we teach them. If a child cannot behave, we punish, which is not how it should be. We should be also being explicit in what the expectations are. And I think that's sometimes the bit that people miss in terms of restorative practice, but which should be fundamental to everything. Let's be respectful to our learners.
I think also it just reminds me of the sense of how we think that we're being supportive when children are struggling. Something came up recently. It was there was a child, and they were deemed to be needing more support in their English, and
Mm.
so they were obviously struggling in English. So therefore, you have to do more English. You have to miss your lunch times because you've got more extra work to do in all of. And it's just like what was, a struggle in their school world, in their life, because you're in school for so often, just magnifies because you're doing more of it. And I had a
Mm.
great conversation with someone who just said, well, actually, they need more of themselves. They need to see this in the bigger picture. They're brilliant at music. Let's do more music. Let's put it in perspective. Let's try and use that as part of what they're doing. And then all of a sudden, development comes in, different ages and all of that. So, like I say, again, we know as the adults, as the people who see the bigger picture, how we can do that. And, the sort of the banging the nail even tighter in and making it even harder as an environment just really isn't supportive in any way.
No, and I think it was a direction of travel, wasn't it? I mean, I remember when I trained to teach that you were encouraged to give your geographer, your scientist, your musician opportunities to communicate their learning in different ways. So, geography, science, etc., was very practical, very hands-on. Whereas now there has been a drive to let's get writing in every single subject because, you know, we need more opportunities for writing. I do understand the need to improve writing as a national picture, but how are you going to give your geographer the opportunity to show themselves as a geographer if their writing isn't their strength? So actually, do we have to have writing in that? There's still an opportunity for them to demonstrate their skill set without having writing. Or are we giving them the scaffolds and the resources that they need to demonstrate their understanding in a different way? Has anybody had a conversation with that child who's struggling in English about what they might need themselves or what they identify that works for them?
Yeah.
And, listen, I work for a software company. I know that I work for a company that provides visual scaffolds. And because they work, they 100% work. But they have to be an item in a toolkit. And the child has to be able to say, in this toolkit, this works for me and identify it, which let's give children a bit of responsibility for that. They know what works for them.
And also, you don't have to teach someone who's really passionate about learning something for the sake of learning. That's the other thing, isn't it? And I think if we had any kind of, I think, excitement about the use of technology and AI and the way classrooms might look differently, I think having more time to do more project-based related things or more sort of focused work around what people are passionate about, or to give them the experiences of lots of different things to be able to do that, then it makes the difference. I mean, the idea of just going away and doing a piece of English work, even now, sort of brings me slightly out with a few chills and and that. However, as a musician, the number of times I've had to write a proposal, I've had to put
Yeah.
together, a presentation to try and have something related to an orchestra tour or something like that. That might not be as fun to me as the actual performing in the tour itself, but it's a fundamental part of something I'm really passionate about.
Yeah.
And so therefore I'm going to work really hard at that. Even if it's something I need to put more effort into, I'm doing it with purpose and for a reason. And
And you
then
have a
you start to.
motivation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so therefore it's not oh no, it's Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock, I've got to do this now. It's
Yeah.
great, this is going to help me achieve what it is that I want to do. And then it becomes a whole different ball game and a whole different world that child's living in.
And particularly, obviously, my background is primary education. So one of the things we often say, we feel that we're very restricted by the curriculum, and it is a loaded curriculum. Teachers are doing a wonderful job, but we do have an ability to be flexible with it. And one of the things I really really tried to push in my school as Senko was that as long as the objectives are being met, does the content matter as much? So if there is a child and their passion is Thomas the Tank Engine and then writing a newspaper report, let him write his newspaper report about Thomas the Tank Engine. Is he still setting it out as a newspaper report? Is he is he using the tools that we expect for a newspaper report and meeting all the objectives? Yes. But does he feel happier about doing it and is more likely to produce something? Yes. Whereas if he'd been told to create his newspaper report on something that happened in the First World War that wasn't really floating his boat, then he probably wouldn't have produced anything. So it's about being willing to have that flexibility. And my concern really in terms of all the reforms that are being proposed, which, you know, I am optimistic about. I do think, as I said, having inclusion at the heart of the reforms is really, really important. But they're going to have limited impact if we don't consider it alongside the curriculum.
Yeah.
And we don't consider it in terms of how we measure schools, because at the moment it's focused on outcomes and the curriculum is focused on content and facts and retrieval. Well, I've got a phone in my hand where I can Google anything. I need to be able to evaluate what I'm reading. And I need to be able to have conversations with people to find out other people's perspectives. Surely those are the skills that we should be focusing on in our curriculum rather than more content. So until we change that aspect, we're going to be very focused on filling our curriculum up with content so that we don't then have time to necessarily have those conversations to find out how individuals best learn. We're also still going to be very focused on getting children to expected standards. And because we know our school's going to be judged on that, we know our children are going to be judged on that, then are we actually thinking about the individual's learning journey then? Not really. That's not what that's, and we go right back to what we said at the beginning about having the individual's learning journey at the heart of everything we do. Then there needs to be some quite significant curriculum reform too.
Yeah, I mean, that makes so much sense, and like you say, it seems such a straightforward thing to do. However, like you say, we're still where we are, and we're sort of restrained in the way that we are. I think one thing that's really key for me within all of that is we're sort of talking about having the Senko within the leadership team.
Mm-hmm.
How how much influence do you think that makes, and what does that actually look like? Is it a question of the leadership taking a more on board how the school could change as a whole to support everybody, or is it a kind of, oh, we didn't quite realize this is what we needed and we have to try and make it fit? And maybe that's the same conversation as the add-on as opposed to the inclusion. But I think there'll be some people thinking, great, every school's got a Senko in the meeting, they're having their say, and it's great, thank you very much for that, and then nothing really changes. And so is there a way of approaching it, the conversations to have, the way to sort of put that point of view across in a way that feels like you're included as a member of staff in actually therefore making
Yeah.
a difference?
Well, I mean, nationally, in terms of SENCOs, the picture is mixed. So the National SENCO Workforce Survey in 2021 found that about 2/3 of SENCOs were actually not on the senior leadership team. And more recently, Sensible SENCO ran a survey in 2026 that suggests that there were improvements in that, but still almost half of those in their survey were not senior leaders. And you may think, like you just said, well, the SENCO's there, they're at the school and they're involved in some conversations. But if without a place on the senior leadership team, the ability to bring about change, true change, in a strategic way is limited. I teach on the NPQ SENCO course for Best Practice Network, and one of the first things we do is get the candidate, the learners to write down all of the stakeholders in a school: governors, teachers, head teachers, cleaners, everybody, and then put a circle around them to demonstrate what they think their circle of influence is over decision making and strategic planning in a school, and also their circle of influence over the environment and the community that they're in. And, of course, it's unsurprising that usually the head teacher circle is pretty big. Interesting variability in how the SENCOs perceive their circle of influence. That actually it's vital that their circle of influence is big. I'm not saying it necessarily has to be bigger than the head teachers, but there has to be that line of communication so that fundamental strategic differences can be made. So when SENCOs are influencing decisions about curriculum, teaching and learning and behaviour, they have to have that place on the senior leadership team to be able to do that. They need to be involved in those conversations, not just, come along and do your send bit. And when you look at the policy making now, when you look at the Ofsted framework, when you're looking at sort of questions that subject leaders are being asked all the time, it's about how is inclusion woven into all of those subjects? How is inclusion woven into the culture of a school? Well, if you haven't got a SENCO sitting on your senior leadership team where those strategic decisions are being made, how is inclusion going to be sat at the heart of everything? Head teachers are pulled in many, many directions. I mean, I'm in quite a unique position actually, because I was a head teacher and a SENCO at the same time for a while as an acting head teacher, which meant I had to have some quite interesting conversations with myself. So I do fully appreciate the directions people are pulled in. And listen, I think most head teachers really have gone into this profession as teachers and have inclusion at the heart of things that they do, have the children's needs at the heart of everything they do. We don't go into this job for the big bucks, do we, necessarily? However, there are some head teachers where at one time, perhaps, they didn't necessarily want a SENCO to be too effective, because an effective SENCO does a good job, which means you attract, communities talk, people talk, families talk. You may attract more people with special educational needs and difficulties. And because of those external pressures that head teachers are under, that might not necessarily have been the direction of travel they wanted to go. And because that's when, as I said before, the results may drop. There's a perception that standards may drop. Actually, in my opinion, as I said before, and what the evidence shows is that when you are thinking about inclusion at the heart of everything, it doesn't just make improvements for children with SEND, it makes improvements for children, all children, full stop. So actually, if you've got a head teacher that puts inclusion at the heart of every decision, and he's got a really effective SENCO sitting alongside him or her, then actually it's going to provide excellence for all. Improvements are going to be made for everybody.
And it just reminds me of the two sides of the coin that I hear a lot recently. One is the head teacher that wants to hear from everybody. They want to know exactly what's going on, SENCO aside or whatever they, wherever they sit within the school. What are the problems? What are the things which are really good? What could they do with more support? And they listen and they hear everything, and then their decisions are made with what they have in front of them to do the best they can. Everyone feels like they're heard, and actually that we're working together as a team. And I think in the bigger picture of all of that, you have fantastic outcomes. And I think the same is true when you see schools who say, oh, we can afford to have music and the arts at the heart of what we do. We can do this, we can do that. Because as we've said before, lots of those children who wouldn't have had opportunities, who suddenly thrive in a world which they suddenly see themselves in, supports the SATs results or all those sorts of things, because there's a whole education going on. The problem, as we know, is the fact that this takes a bit of time, because there's then a culture building going within a school. There's a way of all these things growing. At the end of it, you think everything sort of supports, all the boats rise to the top and everyone's really thriving. But like you, I think, so clearly pointed out there, that there are lots of pressures. It's about what's happening this year. What are our targets? What are the governors saying? What's the government saying? How the budget's going to look. And it's really hard to sort of stand far enough out in terms of that. And so the two sides of the coin, I was thinking, the one side is all of that, understanding all of those things and doing it anyway, knowing we're here for the children, and therefore we are doing the best of what we're doing. The other thing is that sometimes from the sort of the government pressures is actually, if SEND is really now important and it's being told it is, those head teachers who maybe aren't thinking in that holistic way, if that's one way of putting it from that side of the coin, because they're having to have these conversations and it's having to be done that way, yes, almost by hook or by crook, you can start to have those conversations which are going to make a difference. And those people who are enlightened enough and understand at the heart of what we can do, maybe they can start to have a positive influence in the here and now. So it might not be the immediate policy change, but it's a little thing that you can do. It's a conversation that you can have. And that's true, I think, for all of us when we're teaching. You know, we might want the silver bullet to change the whole system, but how we talk to our fellow teacher, our peer, our pupil, whatever it happens to be, makes a difference in the here and now. And both are important. But I think having the perspective of both sides of those coin and knowing where you are in the journey of what that is within a school is really key.
Yeah, and I think, I'm not necessarily here to rave about Ofsted, but the new framework, regardless of whatever the reasoning behind it may have been, the new framework very clearly steers all the conversations to inclusion, and that has made head teachers listen, as you said, regardless, by hook or by crook, as you said, they are having to have those conversations about inclusion and inclusive teaching. So for me, I just think that can only be a positive. And I think it opens that opportunity for people to go back to what their values are, and the values should always be about putting the children at the heart of every conversation and every decision that you make. What will the impact be on the child at the end of the day? And actually, if we're thinking of that and keeping that as our almost like the bar for every conversation that we have, what will the impact be for our pupils, for that child with this need, that child who learns in this way, then we can't really go far wrong. And I think this provides an opportunity. I think the white paper, the Ofsted reforms, provide an opportunity for us to go back to what works for the individual.
And can you sort of frame that from your position within Widget as well? Because, like I say, it offers so much support for so many different people in so many different environments. And sort of as head of education, you're like in that SENCO role, it's that kind of, this is what the education side is, this is what I think we can do and how we can support, but that obviously fits in a bigger picture as well. So do you sort of see some of those sort of correlations and how you sort of support the company to be able to say, look, we have an opportunity here, both in terms of what we're able to offer already, but also, like say, projects that you've got able coming down the pipeline or things that you've been able to put in place that are going to support people that way?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got, as you can imagine, lots of conversations going on about that, really, about my passion here as a head of education at Widget is for people to understand the why. And I think sometimes there's a perception that symbols are there as an add-on. And many times I go into schools and I see excellent use of symbols, but they are being used for one or two individuals. And for me, that goes back to that medical model of disability almost, that it's saying, well, this is you need this, so you've got to have this, that's something different for everybody else, from everybody else. But what I understand about visuals as communications is that they have a place for everybody in terms of they scaffold retention. We know about dual coding theory, that actually seeing something as a visual and in a verbal format goes through the two channels in our brain that help us to retain information. So actually, if you've just got symbols embedded into everything that you do, when you do then present it for a child who really does need it to help them to learn or to help them to communicate, they're going to be much more receptive to it, because actually they see that all their friends are using it too. I often go back to a story of a child who arrived in our setting as a PX pupil, had been excluded from another school for violent and aggressive behaviour, who we very quickly ascertained had severe dyslexia. So for that child, who was significantly larger than most of the other year fives in the class and me, he had quickly learned that the safest option for him was to go into a classroom and punch somebody, because he'd get sent out. And that was a lot safer for him than picking up a book. We knew that visual scaffolds such as Widget would be really helpful for him, because it would help him to access text, it would help him to access the learning, it would help him to demonstrate his skills without relying on written methods or supporting him in developing his written methods. If I had just presented that to him blind, with no experience of symbols, I mean, I probably would have been the next one in line for the punch and he'd have been off. But because symbols were embedded into everyday practice, so because the visual timetables were presented as symbols, because they were used to scaffold key vocabulary, so we always used to start teaching with key vocabulary, then he just saw it as part of everyday life at our school, so he just accepted it. and actually then came into the classroom, stayed in the classroom, began to access learning. I'm not saying we fixed everything, but we made a significant difference in his learning journey. So it comes back to, doesn't it? It's, for me, Widget positioning ourselves as universally available provision, and not just the benefits for some individuals, but actually for the whole of the mainstream sector.
Yeah, and I think we've touched on this earlier on, but the sense that actually now we're able to comprehend and take it as almost a given that whatever the problem, the disability, the struggle that a child has,
Mm.
it doesn't matter whether it's a physical thing or an emotional thing or whatever that range happens to be. And I sort of think back when I was at school, we had someone in school who had a wheelchair, and so there were ramps in order to get into certain parts of the school. And at that point, it's, well, you don't stop children using the ramp who aren't in a wheelchair. That's just part of the access into the school, and they can use steps and they, whatever it happens to be. But it means that
Mm.
everyone can just get into the classroom in whichever way is most supportive for them. Not
Mm.
that ramp's only able to be used from the one person that's in a wheelchair and needs that help
Yeah,
and support. And I think
absolutely.
and I just think that everybody now understanding that, like say, whether it's a visual thing, a symbol related thing, whatever it happens to be, it's there for everyone to use, and
Mm.
whatever is supporting for them is
Yeah.
just going to make the best difference.
I love that. The curb cut effect, isn't it? I love that. I always start my training with a diagram of a lowered curb that's been lowered for wheelchairs to use. But actually, in the picture, you can see somebody pushing a pram, somebody with a sack trolley, somebody wheeling their bike, and actually, they're all using that lowered curb. You liken it to a hotel where some hotels just have steps to go in.
Mm.
Some have one of those lifts where you have to call for someone to raise the lift for you. Well, actually, to me, having to call someone to help actually creates a culture of dependency. So why don't we just have a slope and then everybody can get in? Because when you clear the path for somebody with disabilities, you clear the path for everybody. And
Yeah.
and I think we have to start thinking in terms of clearing the path, not just in terms of physical disabilities, but in terms of accessibility and inclusion. I had a conversation with a teacher, and she was very ill. If she's listening to this, she'll know who she is. But she turned out to be one of the strongest teachers I ever knew in terms of inclusion. But she had a child in her class who wanted to, who was reluctant to write, but she had a sparkly pink pencil, and if she wrote with a sparkly pink pencil, she'd write. Now all the other children had their standard HB, yellow and black pencils in the class that we all remember well. And she got quite agitated about this and said, well, why should she have something different from everybody else? And I said, yeah, because if a child came in to your classroom in the wheelchair, we'd have to sit them on the plastic stool. Why should they have something different? And she looked at me and just went, touche. And actually, I don't know whether it was a shift in her thinking. She was a fantastic teacher, and even weeks later, she'd be coming back to me saying, "Oh, I've got this child, and I wonder if you can help me with how I can scaffold his learning." But yeah, I used the same example. Why are we so reluctant to make things more accessible for everybody? I think we understand it much more from physical disabilities perspective, but actually things that are preventing us from learning, there can be a whole host of reasons, sensory difficulties, differences, the environment not feeling a comfortable place for learning, things that we may not even be aware of. So let's go back to the heart of it. Let's go back to the children and find out from them what they need and what helps.
Yeah, I love that. And it just struck me then, it's like, do we really want standardized anything? And so in that great example of the pencil, there doesn't need to be a standard pencil. There just needs to be
No,
a pencil that works. And
absolutely.
whether that's physically works or,
Yeah.
like say, emotionally works, so to speak.
And isn't the thing that sets us aside in our culture, in this country in particular, is our ability to be creative. That's always been a thing that we do well in this country, is that we are creative. So why do we want everyone to be peas in a pod? We want to encourage creativity. Some of the most successful people have neurodivergent profiles
Yeah.
because they've had to think differently. They've had to think outside the box. So shouldn't we be encouraging that? You know, yeah, within, as we said before, within an understanding of accepted behaviors and things that help us work collectively as a group as well.
Yeah.
But children are really good at that. I'm
They
really
are.
good at understanding that people need different things. They really are.
I think we don't give credit where credit's due from that point of view, isn't it? We know the adults, we know what's best, and actually we just need to listen sometimes as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Now, obviously, the acronym FAR is really important to us here at Education on Fire, and by that we mean feedback, inspiration, resilience, and empowerment. What is it that strikes you when you hear that, whether it's one word or collectively?
Oh gosh, they all resonate actually, because fe feedback is quite a difficult thing to take sometimes, but actually we learn more, don't we, from experiences that haven't gone quite so well than we do from things that go well. So it's being willing to be open to feedback. Even when I started at Widget, I asked the previous head education to come and sit and watch me do my first presentation, because you need to be open to that feedback. Um, Resilience, we are going through a period of big changes in education at the moment. So yes, I think we are going to have to be quite resilient, but actually try and see it as an opportunity. We're being empowered now to be able to make decisions that 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 probably take us back to the roots of what made us teachers in the first place. So actually try and embrace that. We're being given this golden opportunity to say, how can we make our classrooms more inclusive? Well, I think that will take teachers back to why they went into teaching in the first place. You know, I came into teaching to make a difference to that child in my classroom, and going back to those 3 P's of inclusion. So let's see this as an opportunity to be empowered to use our skills as teachers again. And I'm
Yeah.
not saying that's an easy job, and I know there are lots of pressures, but yeah, let's try and see it as an opportunity to feel empowered.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It's not an easy job, and there's lots going on. But it's down to the next conversation, the next thing, and I think also from that kind of well-being standpoint, it's also around the sense of what can I do for myself so that next time I have these meetings or a difficult conversation or feel like it's a really hard day, I have the skills to know I can do it today and tomorrow and all those things as well, which I know is a completely different rabbit hole that we won't have time to get into today. But I think
Yeah.
really, really important.
Yeah, but I mean, if we are, sometimes people think that this is going to be an actually additional thing, that thinking of inclusion at the outset is an additional thing, but actually, ultimately, it will make your life easier.
Yeah.
Because if you're planning from it at the outset, you're not thinking it as an additional thing. You're thinking about, I'm going to cover all the learning needs of my classroom at the point of planning. You're going to find it easier. I mean, even using visuals is one example. It stops you from having to repeat yourself 25 times. Verbals transient, visuals
Yeah.
are there and permanent. So it will
Yeah.
help you.
Exactly. And do you think that sort of the analogy of sort of taking a step back to go forward is true in here? It's that kind of, I know this is going to take a little bit more work. I might be just sort of resetting or reframing how I'm doing things, but I know that once those key things are in place, it's going to give me the freedom to be able to sort of really fly with my children beyond that.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally think that. And then coming back, almost full circle to the SENCO, then having that position of authority to help make those strategic decisions, that's going to be really, really important in that, because they will have a lot of influence in saying, in delivering training, in planning resource strategies. They have to keep coming back to that well-being as well, and that's saying, okay, this may seem like something difficult, but what we are doing is going to benefit you in the long run. But they still need to be at the heart of the decisions that are being made to get those things in place in the first place.
Yeah, brilliant, fantastic. Well, that's a great way of rounding off, I think. There, tell people where they can find out more about Widget, and obviously from there they'll be able to sort of see sort of how you're able to help.
Yes. Yeah, well, we have widget.com, and if you go to widget.com, you can find out more about the software that we have available. Widget Online and in print are our two main pieces of software that we sell. But there's lots of training on there, there's lots of support, and there's also lots of success stories that are really good for inspiration to take a look at, to see how people are using symbols really well in their environments.
Perfect, Lisa. Thank you so much. It's great to hear the minds and the people and the conversations behind all these things. And I think, like I say, to be able to get that support from being able to hear what other people are doing as well as the actual solutions in terms of the product as well is amazing. Yeah. So thanks so much for being here.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire.